as I watch the Jonathan character dissolve a little more during this retreat, whatever is sort of left, and then as I self-reflect on what the experience is, it's happening through, in part, I don't know what to call it, a system, a way of thinking, a philosophy, an understanding. For instance, when I read about a Zen Roshi, or many of them actually, far too many in World War II, who were celebrated as awakened, and yet really took a very fundamentalist and traditionalist stance in supporting, the Imperial Japan's ambitions. That there's the understanding and lived experience through, in part, an order of or way of being in consciousness, a stage prior to awakening.
Yes, I think I see what you're saying, and yes, I agree that after the recognition of our true nature, that the conditioning, correct me if I've not understood you, but I think this is what you're saying, that the conditioning that you were subjected to, let's say for 50 years prior to the awakening to your true nature, that conditioning, the way you think, for instance, culturally, that you gave the example of Japan, so the way you think culturally, that the structure, the architecture of your mind will still be in place, and that you will still think in a way that is governed by this conditioned framework. That is true. But still, much of the way you think will be changed by the understanding. So although the framework, your traditional Japanese beliefs or your traditional English beliefs or whatever it is may remain, these beliefs wouldn't cause you to behave in ways that were not consistent with the non-dual understanding. So you may choose still to live according to the customs of your culture, and most people do. Most people stay in their community, their culture, and they're still subjected to the laws and customs of that culture. And you still may abide by all those laws, even though in your heart you're much freer. You may still consent to, but you wouldn't do anything, even if your culture asked you to. You wouldn't do anything that fundamentally conflicted with your understanding. If that's what you're.
Well, so the answer I'm intuiting is that then the bar or definition of a true awakening is much higher than the culture is holding it. So in that case, if a Roshi, a celebrated Roshi, were, gung-ho and we need to take over China and Indonesia and so forth, that would be a demonstration to us that there was not a full or authentic.
But don't forget, not everybody who has realized their true nature teaches or speaks about these matters. In fact, most don't. And not everybody who teaches or speaks about these matters has realized their true nature. In fact, well, I won't go further, but so, just because somebody is in the history books we hear of somebody being a celebrated Roshi, I mean, the vast majority of what we read about in the spiritual literature is not an expression of truth. It's an expression of truth that has been filtered through, usually through several egos, and has come out. So the majority of what we find in the traditional religious and spiritual literature is not an expression of the original truth upon which that tradition was founded. So we should be very cautious about just thinking that because someone sets up their camp and has a website, Non-Dual Teacher, age 23. I had this an awakening experience last week, and now I'm a fully fledged teacher. We should be very, very cautious about that, and also indeed about what history tells us, that there, just as now, in our culture, there are a very, very broad range of people speaking about these matters, and they are not all saying the same thing. This idea that we sometimes hear, everybody's saying the same thing in different ways. This is not true. Some people, a few people, are saying the same thing in different ways, but most people are speaking about different level of understanding. And nothing wrong with that, no criticism of anybody, but that is true of our era, and it must therefore have been true of all previous eras, except that history has blurred the differences between all these speakers. So once everyone's been dead for 200 or 300 years, we just group them all together and think these were all enlightened masters talking about the same thing. Well, they weren't. They were expressing very different levels of understanding. They may all have been, most of them expressing some level of truth, but they were not all expressing the highest non-dual understanding, just as nowadays not all the people that speak about these matters are speaking about the highest non-dual understanding. Again, no criticism of them, but it's just a statement of fact.
So is it your understanding that, just to use just 3 levels because it's simpler, like traditional and modern and postmodern, that a true and deep and thoroughgoing awakening essentially burns up that stage, that way of seeing the world? Because my intuition is that that it's not absolutely discrete and absolutely separate, certainly not, but that in some ways it has its own substance or reality.
I don't think it burns away completely the way of seeing the world, but it definitely informs the way we see the world. It deeply informs the way we see the world, and more importantly, the way we act and relate in the world. We still may, one could easily be, and indeed that there are many such people, there can be someone who has fully recognized their true nature, never speaks about these matters to everybody, to anybody. Nobody thinks of them as someone who has recognized their true nature. They still live in their community. They still go to work every morning. They still raise their kids or not, or whatever. And they still are a law-abiding citizen. They still vote in an election. They still pay their taxes. And such a person would be under the radar. Nobody would ever say of him or her, oh, this person has recognized their true nature, or is a teacher, or anything like that. It would be quite possible. In fact, I would suggest that most people who have recognized their true nature live like that. And just going on from that, not on the subject of your question, but just going on this idea, it's a very common idea that somehow when one recognizes one's true nature, one becomes a kind of special or an extraordinary enlightened person. There's no such thing as an enlightened person. That a few people who recognize their true nature may express it in some conventional form, a verbal form, writing or speaking. But many people who have this recognition express it in other ways, through art or just through their everyday life, just through the way they're dealing with people all the time. They never, and such a person would never have a sense of themselves being enlightened. In fact, I would suggest that nobody who recognizes that their true nature has a sense of being enlightened or being an enlightened person. So it's very, in our culture, that there's an idea that someone who's recognized their true nature becomes a kind of extraordinary person. And this is, of course, because of the literature that's been handed down to us. We hear stories about the great masters, and many of them could fly or walk on water or whatever it is that they were supposed to be able to do. So this builds up in us this feeling that recognizing our true nature brings with it just makes you somehow an extraordinary, unusual person. Not at all, but